India. I'm Mohan, greetings from Sri Lanka. I'm going to talk to you about balanced, inclusive green growth. First, my thanks to the organizers. It's wonderful to be in this beautiful and historic city where Guimarães was the birthplace of Portugal. I also chair the International Scientific Advisory Committee, which is supporting Guimarães in its bid for the European Green Capital Award. You know, Guimarães was the European Cultural Capital in 2012. It will soon become the European Green Capital. As a scientist, I will try to focus on key scientific issues today. We will discuss why we need repensar, reinventar, reconquistar, and try to find solutions to the problems of sustainable development. We also will talk about balanced, inclusive green growth, or BIGG, and the Sustainomics framework, which is the key solutions for people, planet, and prosperity. These global problems are serious, but we can overcome them if we work together now to implement the solutions that we already know. So there is no excuse for inaction or delay. Now, let's start by talking about the critical sustainable development challenges that can cause global collapse. We have poverty and inequality, which is very well known for the last 50 years. We have resource shortages, food, energy, water, and so on. We have problems of the financial sector, especially since 2008, and I know that Portugal has suffered greatly. We have unexpected shocks and disasters. We have conflicts, but particularly we suffer from weak leadership at the very top, at the global level, and we'll talk about that later. There is, of course, climate change, which is considered the ultimate threat multiplier because it makes all the other problems worse. Now, these multiple threats interact badly, but our responses are very uncoordinated because we, the 7 billion stakeholders in the planet, are not united. But we have decisive action coming from mid-level leadership, and I think Guimarães is an example, and where leaders of communities, mayors of cities, company CEOs, and civil society are trying to lead the way forward to sustainability, to find very integrated solutions, whereas the leaders of the world, presidents and prime ministers, are not doing their job, in my opinion. Let's start with a very simple concept, okay? And this is the problem of overconsumption, inequality, and poverty. There is an idea called the ecological footprint of humanity, which is basically the amount of pressure that we as a human race puts on the global ecosystem. And if you look in 2012, we were using more than 50%, over 50% of the sustainable capacity of the Earth. That's 1.5 times what we should be using. By 2030, we will need 2 planets to sustain our lifestyles as we know it today as a human race. Now, let's ask also, who is doing all this consumption? If you see this, this is the infamous champagne glass, which tells you that 85% of consumption is done by the top 1.4 billion people, the richest people. They are consuming more than 60 times the poorest 1.4 billion. And if you look at the wealth, you see that the 8 richest people on the planet are, in fact, wealthier than 3.5 billion, half the planet's population. So that is the problem of inequality. Now, if you put these two together, you look at the bottom, you see the unmet goals and broken promises. In 1947, there was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which everything that is now promised in the Sustainable Development Goals today is already there. It was 70 years ago, and we have had many, many promises, the Rio Earth Summit, the Kyoto Protocol, the Millennium Development Goals, and finally now the Sustainable Development Goals. These are worthy goals, but if the rich are consuming already more than one planet worth, where are the resources to raise the poor out of poverty? This is the question to ask. And if you look at the asset crisis and the behavior of the financial sector, you can see that we are probably going to have another financial crisis very soon if we don't reform. So how do we find the solutions? We have this Sustainomics framework, which will provide an integrated approach, and we have a pathway called Balanced Inclusive Green Growth. Sustainomics was first presented at 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit, but since then it has been widely applied in many parts of the world. There are several core concepts. The first one, which is very important, is called climbing the mountain. How do you make development more sustainable? If this is like climbing a mountain, the top is covered with clouds, it's a little mysterious, we don't know where we are going. But what we do is we take one step at a time as we climb uphill, and we know as long as we keep walking, we will reach the peak, right? And this is what I'm asking you to do, because many unsustainable activities are already obvious. When we leave this room, we switch off the light. If we see a tap running, we can close the tap. We can plant a tree. So it's up to you and I to do this in our day-to-day activities at the personal level, at the level of companies, cities, countries, and so on. Right? The second core concept is also extremely important, and that is to harmonize the Sustainable Development Triangle, again, which I presented in 1992. As we know, we have an economic dimension. Why? Because there are a lot of poor people in the world, so we have to become more wealthy in order to raise the poor out of poverty. But we also have the environmental side, that we don't want to ruin the air, the water, and the land in order to become rich. And the third side is, of course, social, that we have to include everybody. We have to have participation, and so on. And I think Guimarães in particular, I'm impressed that is a very good model of this inclusive approach. Now, unfortunately, in the world, we are practicing exactly the opposite. We have an unsustainable triangle. If you look, unethical social values are very dominant. We have violence, we have injustice, we have inequality, greed, and so on. That is driving us. This has caused what I say is a model of economic maldevelopment, which basically means we have unsustainable growth that is based on debt. We have extreme market forces, poverty, inequality, and so on. If you think some generations ago, your grandparents saved more than you did, and I did. And it is their saving which was invested, which is benefiting us. We are living well. But we have learned a different truth. We have learned that it is better to borrow than to save. So we are borrowing, but we are borrowing from our grandchildren. We can live very well, but our grandchildren will have to pay an environmental debt and other things. So the less resources you have, then the social conflicts increase because people are fighting over scarce resources. So we have a bad cycle, and the space for action is shrinking all the time. So we have to break this. Now, the third core concept is in our own minds. This is how we break the cycle, through innovation and fresh ideas. We have to replace unsustainable values. We have to think more in terms of moral values and not in terms of greed, selfishness, and violence. We have to think across disciplines, because it is not just a question of engineering or medicine or law. All of these and many others, we have to work together. We have to think in terms of big spaces. the whole globe, not our own neighborhood. We have to think in terms of long time span, centuries, not tomorrow or the next week. And we have to have multiple stakeholders because we have to bring government, civil society and business together, because governments alone are finding it less and less possible to solve the complex problems of the world. And the core concept here is the full cycle application of tools so that you can have solutions that are integrated. And there are many practical examples. This is not just theory. I can tell you websites where you can find other countries and other cities and other communities which have solved the problems this way. Now, let's talk very briefly about balanced, inclusive green growth. Very briefly, the story is that up to 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, we were very enthusiastic. There was euphoria that we have found the solution, sustainable development. But in 1992 and afterwards, we discovered that it is difficult to implement. And therefore, what we did is we did it, a small group of us in the 1990s decided that we have to have a step-by-step approach, climbing the mountain, because it's such a complicated issue. And first, we have to find what is called green growth. And if you look at this diagram, what you see here is that you try to do all three together. See, all three faces are not happy. It's like a love triangle, two guys and a girl. It's a formula for disaster. So you have disharmony, no balance or integration. Now, you first start with economic and environment together, and that is green growth. And you see that couple are happy, but the social side, you focus on poverty, you keep it a little separate for the time being. Right? This is the green growth, right? Two at a time. And now we come to the second stage where we bring all three together. Okay, so those two get married and the third guy is the best man. Okay, so all are happy. And that is balanced, inclusive green growth. And this is the situation we are in today, post-2015. Hopefully, we will find that approach, right? Let's apply this to this problem of climate change. Very quickly, what I can tell you about climate change, one aspect is very important, and that is the injustice. You see, poor countries and poor communities are going to suffer most from climate change. But this is very unfair because they are the ones who had the least to do with creating the problem. But if we can find this integrated, the balanced, inclusive green growth path, we can solve not only the problem of climate change, but also poverty, hunger, all of them together, right? And you see the little the cartoon at the bottom, the South, the poor feel that the rich countries are asking them to reduce their emissions. They are hardly doing any emissions at all, right? So there is an issue of climate justice. How do we solve this problem with this green growth approach? Now, if you look very carefully, the vertical axis tells us the environmental issue, which is greenhouse gas emissions, right? On the horizontal axis, we have the economic issue, which is per capita income, okay, GNP. If you're a poor country, you have low emissions, but you have also low income. If you're a rich country, you are at point C, which is above the safe limit for high emissions, but also you are rich. And many countries are in the middle at point B. So the first step is for the rich countries to transform. That is, they have to reduce their emissions, but they can continue to have good economic performance. You don't have to become poor to reduce your emissions. There is another path, and that is for the countries in the middle. They cannot afford to grow on the same high curve of the rich countries because there are not enough resources on the planet. There is not enough carbon space, there is not enough water, not enough energy, not enough minerals. They have to find this green growth tunnel, okay? This is called the technological leapfrog, and we have innovators and others who are doing this finding the transformation path. And then, in that tunnel that you can see, you can find also the inclusive path, which is not only green growth, but it also includes the poor. So it also addresses the issue of poverty. And there are methods of doing this. So what we have here is, for the rich family at the top, certainly they can have a very good lifestyle, but they can have a simpler, less packaging maybe, and other things that they can do so that they can maintain their lifestyle but have a less material intensive lifestyle. For the family at the bottom, they have to be raised out of poverty, but they have to grow along the green growth path, right? They cannot grow on the wasteful path of the rich. So these two are the two, and food waste is a very good example because 1/3 of the world food produced in the world is wasted. Many of it is in our own homes. There's a lot of, particularly in the wealthy people's homes. And this is where the global vision comes in, that you have an economic model of prosperity where you respect the environment and society, but on the social side, you want to meet the basic needs of all people. You want to have peace, harmony, and security. And on the environmental side, you want to live within the sustainable resource base of the planet. And that is why you have 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We are trying hard, but there is no guarantee that it will work. And let me just briefly mention in pricing how this works. If you look at the price of water, the economic approach tells you that prices must be raised because water is scarce, right? So this is the growth-based approach. The environmental protection tells you that because you have a lot of pollution, therefore you have to raise the price of water even more to pay for the pollution cost. But if you go to the social side, you'll see exactly the opposite, because if you raise the price of water too high, the poor cannot afford it. So you have to balance it by providing cheap water for the poor to meet their minimum needs. And that is the inclusive green growth part, okay, where you balance social, environmental, and economic. There is also the example of Sustainable Musica, which is a group of musicians launched at 2012 in Rio when I was there, and it is for music lovers, because this kind of speech only reaches 0.001% of the world's population. It's appealing to the mind, but through music we can reach hundreds of thousands of people who are very open, and that's what we are doing with Sustainable Musica, right? Through sustainable production techniques, I have worked with some of the biggest companies in the world, and we have encouraged them to practice sustainability, and that resource efficiency is the way to go, where they can increase their profit, but at the same time save the planet because they are using less resources. So we try to bring sustainable consumers and sustainable producers together. There are very few, but hopefully this will spread throughout the city, throughout the world, throughout the country, and throughout the planet, so that you have a sustainable society. And my magic formula here is, you can make money, but you can also do good, and you can be very contented. And finally, the Sustainable Development Triangle also applies to people, right? In your work, you have income and job satisfaction, which is extremely important, but don't forget your health, fitness, disease-free, and you have the social side, your family and your friends. Unless you keep that triangle in balance, you will not have a sustainable lifestyle. You will not be a well-balanced person. So my final message basically is, we have multiple global problems. We can solve these problems today if we start working on this, the balanced, inclusive green growth path and the Sustainomics approach. We have to be bottom up. We have to help our leaders to solve these problems. And I'm sure TED is helping to create these new values and behaviors for the 21st century eco-civilization. And I have great faith in the young who can solve these problems. This is a last quote. This is the ancient Pali blessing from Sri Lanka, which says, "May the rains come in time," it's the environment. "May the harvest be bountiful," which is economic. "May the people be happy and contented. May the king be righteous." That is the social side. So many hundreds of years ago, they knew about the Sustainable Development Triangle. We are trying to relearn that. I am from the Munasinghe Institute of Development. We do work in these areas. There are other publications if you want. Obrigado, Stuti. Thank you very much.